hope we're going to have plenty of time today anyway. I don't think I'm going to run over. We'll apologise in advance if we get any interruptions. I'm at home by myself with a bunch of my kids, so they've been warned to leave me alone, but you never know.
It's okay. In the recording, we'll get Alexandro to pixelate them in every single frame they're in, frame by frame. He's had practice.
Absolutely, should keep him busy for a while.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, lots of people joining right now.
Away from Taxmaster.
Okay, I think. Sorry, John, go.
No, don't worry, it's fine. Keep going.
Okay, you might want to kick off now, and I'll let people in as they come in.
Okay, yeah, sure. So as I've already said, if you've just joined, my name is Matthew Slow. I'm going to be doing the first half of today's session on delegated authentication, particularly with the Shibboleth IDP, but actually the principles apply to other things as well. And then the second half is going to be my colleague John, who's going to be talking about readiness for the SHIB v4 upgrade that you almost certainly have planned or should have planned fairly soon. Feel free to interrupt me. If you stay on mute while you're not talking, but if you do want to interrupt me mid-flow, feel free. Otherwise, use the chat window and leave a question or something in there, and either someone will answer it for me or we'll get to it at the end. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the Shibboleth IDP, integrating it to essentially move the authentication process from the IDP, doing it to something else. Now, I'm going to step back slightly and just say, what's the point of all this? What's the point of doing federated access? The sort of the core use case is getting access to other resources. We want to do it securely. We don't want to overcomplicate the workflow. And a way of doing that with a load of disparate things spread all over the place is with a process like SAML. Now SAML 2, other flavors are available, but in the HE and education research area, that has standardized on SAML and SAML 2. And various bits of software came along to facilitate that. And it leads to this process of sort of the precursor to SSO, which is a single source of sign-on. If everything routes through one username and password originally, won't get into the security complexities of how that should work now, but generally you have one identity that you would use to access all of your random third-party services spread all over the place, and SAML 2 is the glue that keeps all that hanging together. Once you've got there, you also get single sign-on as an added bonus. The IDP that you're using to authenticate, you can store a session cookie and say, actually, this person that accessed service 1 over there half an hour ago is now accessing service 2. Well, we already know who they are. We don't need to challenge them again. So you get that element of at least web-based single sign-on as a sort of, I've described it as a fortuitous extra. It's a nice bonus. Alongside that, once you've got to single sign-on, there's a whole load of extra wins. From a user's perspective, there's one set of wins, and from an organizational security stance perspective, there's a whole separate set of wins. Now, I've sort of ordered them here because actually they do sort of map together. From a user perspective, less login screens, less annoyance, more better. Less challenges, less sort of things getting in the way of your what you're trying to achieve, more better. Once you've got to single source of sign-on, one directory, one username and password for as many things as we can possibly cram into it, less passwords to remember, more better. I've said less interruptions. It's the same sort of thing. It's once you've got this process in place, there should be less things in the way stopping you and making you pause and think, oh, what am I doing? Oh, hang on. Oh, yes. Okay. So the whole thing becomes more seamless, and therefore it's much easier to access content, services, whatever else. From an organizational perspective, there's less login screens for a user or a potentially very large user base to need to remember and trust. Because as soon as you have lots of login screens for a user to remember and trust, they're not going to notice when one of them gets hijacked. or they might not notice when one of them gets hijacked. Therefore, you can be far more confident that when that does happen, someone is going to mention it, and therefore you can take remedial action. There's less passwords for users to forget, which sounds like a silly thing to say, but actually the more usernames and passwords have, they either set them to be the same thing, or they need some other process of remembering what they are. And if they are doing what they should be doing and setting them randomly, then they either need to remember them all, which is unlikely to happen, or keep them in some sort of password vault. Those two cases, probably not likely for the majority of users. Therefore, they all use the same one, or at least variations on the same one, which either makes them easy to remember for them or easy for an attacker to penetrate. Once you've got past those things, less challenges and less interruptions means hopefully less grumbling. Your users will be hopefully much more accepting of this process, because actually it's streamlined, it doesn't get in their way too much, and actually it's doing what they need it to do. And from a security perspective, greater visibility of authentication. So once you've got all of these authentications and these user flows going through one place, you can have a much better idea of what's going on, and therefore do some trend analysis to say, where is it going wrong? Where is the authentication from, I don't know, Vietnam, which we've never seen that user there. But 10 minutes ago, they logged in from Bristol. They're now in Vietnam. This doesn't look right. We can flag that and do stuff. And that's where various products can help with that. And I'm not going to talk any more about that, but that once you've got everything flowing through this one place, it can be much more easy to pick up on things like that. And again, once you've got it into a central place, you can tack on other things and essentially roll them out across an entire service estate very easily. Things like centralized MFA and other sort of UI type notifications. Maybe you've got some news that you need to put out. You can put it on the central login page. Everyone will see it because we know everyone's going through there, because everyone has to go through it to get to their work. So that's single sign-on as a principle. And where you might be now is having a shibboleth IDP, and probably, and I'm not going to say this for everyone, but a lot of places have started outsourcing various aspects of their core service, things like email and stuff, to either Office 365 or Google or something else. But in the bad old days, you probably had hundreds and hundreds of these login screens lurking around in various different bespoke services and this, that, and the other, maybe all talking to an LDAP, maybe not. And the idea is to consolidate that down as much as you possibly can to a small number of trusted sign-on experiences, places that you want your users to divulge their credentials. And so that they can do that in a trusted way. And you might pick the shibboleth IDP to be that central point of trust, or you might pick something like the Microsoft Azure Google account login system as that instead. Pros and cons either way. I'm not going to go into the pros and cons of that now. I'm going to focus on essentially taking the view that we want to centralize on Azure or Google or something else that does that process for you. I'm going to mainly talk about Azure, because that's where I've done this the most. We've also done it with ADFS. I believe we've done a Google integration as well. I swear to that. But the process is pretty much the same in at least in conceptual building blocks. So hopefully this is going to be reusable. Now I'm talking about SAML2 delegation, and actually you could probably replace that with just delegation, because although I'm talking about SAML2, you could use something like CAS or any other thing that fulfills the building blocks that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So take this with a little pinch of salt if you want to for other platforms, but it should be hopefully portable across other things. Now, essentially, you start off at the moment with everything up to about this line. You've got your users, you've got your services out in the federation, and you've got your shibboleth IDP hooked up to some sort of directory, mostly an Active Directory, but not always an Active Directory. And this is all working very nicely. User comes along and they want to sign in, they get punted over to an IDP. IDP pops up the login screen, says, who are you? You authenticate yourself, it checks you. My mouse has stopped moving. It checks you out, grabs your attributes and issues an assertion back to the service to log you in. Now, what we're doing is bolting a second layer of authentication onto the side of that. The actual process that's going on inside the IDP is two steps. There's an authentication step, and then there's an attribute resolution step. We're taking the authentication step and pushing that somewhere else. And how we're doing that is using a second service provider, which sits and wraps up the IDP in a way that means that when a user comes along for the first time and hits the IDP, they actually don't hit it first time. They get punted straight over to Azure, whatever else. I'm just going to say Azure for now. And they get challenged to log in over here using the Azure directory. It returns a SAML assertion with a username in. The IDP then accepts that through the remote user authentication flow, looks the user up in a directory. I'll come back to the synchronization in a minute. Gets all the attributes that they would just have got anyway, exactly the same process, just using that username that's come from a third-party source rather than from inside the IDP, and then writes the assertion and sends it back over to the originating service. Now, these two directories, they might be the same directory, depends how your third-party SAML IDP is rigged up. You know, mileage may vary, but essentially what needs to happen is that this assertion that comes back has to have an attribute in it that can uniquely identify the user so that the IDP can go and look them up in its data source. They don't have to be the same data source. They could be, but they don't have to be. I think I've talked about everything that's on there. Why do we want to put in this complexity? Now, why don't we just say, well, we'll just punt everything off to Azure. We'll register our Azure IDP on the Federation and it'll just work. Well, no, it won't, because firstly, the commercial facing SAML2 IDPs, although they are mostly SAML2 compliant, can't handle things like the massively meshed nature of the UK Federation and EduGain. There's something on the region of 3,500 services on the metadata aggregate that the UKF provides. You could sit and register the ones that you want and put all their signing keys and whatever else into Azure or whatever else, and keep them up to date every time that they change. But that's quite a lot of work, and that's what the Federation is doing for you. On the side of that, there's various attributes that the HE community have started using, things like the EduPerson targeted ID, and a couple of others that are quite difficult or impossible to generate using things like Azure. So in order to facilitate both the sort of the massively meshed nature and these other attributes, we've sort of shimmed, hopefully in a nice and transparent way, the Shibboleth IDP into the middle to use something like Azure, Shibboleth IDP in the middle, and then Federation facing on the other side. So in terms of how we actually do this, how we plug these things together, is my mouse working? Yes, it is. The IDP is deployed within Tomcat. We use Tomcat because it supports the AJP protocol, which is what we need in a minute. And then around that is the Apache web server. Plugged into the Apache web server is the Shibboleth SP. Other bits of software can be plugged in here instead. There's other SAML2 compliant ones like ModMelon, or there's things like the CAS service provider that you could plug in here as well. And it should all just work in exactly the same way. But the upshot of this is the SP that gets deployed is protecting the remote user endpoint of the IDP that we're using. The upshot of that is when someone comes along and tries to log in, or rather tries to authenticate, the IDP will send them to the remote user endpoint. Apache will get in the way and say, oh, you hang on a minute, we don't know who you are yet. The SP will start off a second SAML authentication request, punt you off to the upstream IDP. You could have a discovery process built into that as well, so there could potentially be more than one of these if you needed to. Then authentication happens over here outside of our control on this side. Something something authenticates them, something finds the right attribute, probably a SAM account name or some other username, sends them back, hits the appropriate consumer service on the SP side. Everything unwinds, and then the next request is the original remote user request, which gets punted through to the IDP. Attribute resolution happens, and then after that, it's exactly the same as it would otherwise have been, and everything unwinds, and the assertion goes out to the originating service. I've probably talked about most of this slide already. Existing Shibboleth IDP probably talks to an AD for authentication and attribute resolution at the moment. Maybe you've started to outsource to Azure and or other things. Might have tacked on things like the mostly easy to use multi-factor authentication that Azure and Google and stuff provides. Some sort of synchronization is happening between the directories. Might be AAD Connect, might be something else, and an attribute is available to join these two user ecosystems up. We reconfigure the SHIB IDP to delegate the authentication up to Azure using a SHIB SP on the local side and a non-gallery app in Azure. I'm aware that there are different subscription levels in Azure, and not all of them have the non-gallery app. So you'd need to check that that's something that's available within Azure if you're going to do that. Azure then returns a username, probably a SAM account name, in the response, and the SHIB IDP uses that to look up the rest of the attributes, probably from your local Active Directory, but it doesn't have to be, and then writes the assertion just like it did before. SHIB IDP 4, everything I've said so far applies out of the box to SHIB IDP 3 and can be used in exactly the same plumbing for IDP 4. A new feature that's come along in V4 is something called SAML proxying, which we're still looking at. Hopefully it will allow us to massively simplify this and go off to the third-party IDP to pick up these attributes and essentially repackage them for the Edugain UKF type world. We're hoping to put out some guidance on that in the future, but we're not quite there yet. That having been said, the model wrapping Tomcat up in some sort of service provider would still be needed for other authentication protocols that aren't SAML2 anyway. So you might want to keep that, and it should provide a nice upgrade path anyway. Next steps, we have, I believe, just published some documentation on doing the delegated authentication, which will apply to V3 and V4. I think the coming very soon actually means we pushed it out today. I'm sure John will pipe up if I'm wrong. And then the guidance for V4 proxying will hopefully follow in the next month or so. We did notice during an implementation last week that there's a bug in the Azure portal in terms of its metadata upload handling, in that it just doesn't accept anything. They've arbitrarily decided that a new bit of the metadata XML schema is required where nothing else thinks it is, and hopefully they say they're rolling out a fix at the end of this week, but you never know. So we had to configure that one manually rather than ingest the metadata. I think that's my last one. So I'm going to pop over onto, if anyone likes to interrupt now, I'm just going to have a look through the chat and see if there's any questions.
Shall I interrupt a second?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so yeah, Matthew's put the page up for delegated authentication. We've put a page up on the Federation website just describing this kind of scenario. This is not the only way to do it. We're not the only people who can do this. There are other services that can do this. Open Athens can do this. I can see that Avert can do it as well with Shibboleth ADFS Bridge. I don't know the details of how those work, but they achieve broadly similar results. We've now put our guide up. Our guide is based on the documentation that we've had for well, you'll see by the versioning, but you'll see that we've had that around for about 2 years in various guises, and we've just put together the documentation that we have on doing this with Azure, ADFS, and also NetIQ Access Manager, if anyone's using that. And
so I'm just looking through. Robert Bradley has asked multiple flows if you want to push auth-n requirements back to the Azure IDP. Are you talking about the MFA type online multi-factor push notification?
No, what I was thinking of there is, say you have an SP that just requires the standard authentication request. So I don't care too much what it is, just authenticate me user and hand them back to me, versus I have an SP that says I want to force re-authentication, or I need to do something like I need to request MFA only for this particular user.
So the force auth-n flow, we do have to disable that. It doesn't work with this going through the remote user SHIB IDP flow. Doesn't work with force auth-n, if that answers your question.
It does partly. We've managed to get it working by basically copying the remote user flow beans and XML files and basically duplicating the flow and then pointing it at another endpoint on our Apache layer that then goes off and tells WebAuth to do a forced authentication. In this case, it would be the Shibboleth SP and Azure MFA or the Azure IDP.
Yeah.
But that obviously is a bit hacky.
Yes.
You'd like for each possible combination you want to support.
Yeah. No, it is a bit of a. I mean, I don't think we see very many uses of force auth-n in a open federation sense. I can see the usage internally for sort of local services that you want to be particularly secure. But no, in the model that I've described doesn't work with force auth-n.
Yes, that's what I thought. Although I see that SAML proxying option will potentially support that, which is what I'd expect.
I haven't had a chance to play with that yet.
Nor have I, so I shall forward to playing with it at some point in the future.
Yeah, I did want to say that, I mean, obviously everybody has their terminology, but I want to be really careful because what we call delegation is not this. We have a delegation feature in SHIB that is not this and is actually in the process of being deprecated in case we're trying to find out if anyone's still using it because it's super complicated and we don't want to keep the code if no one's using it. What we call this is proxying, and what SAML calls this is proxying. So from a, if you're translating between documentation, you should be aware of that.
We'll pick that up with you another time. Have I missed any other questions in there?
I think we've been confused as to what to call it all along.
In the SAML spec, it's called proxying. So if you're looking for a term, that would be my advice because that's what's in the standard.
Okay, so yeah, we'll look at that. Thanks.
I've got a question. Okay, I'm running Shibboleth 4 and I was planning to use SAML proxying to Azure. Now, Azure has intrusion detection, so it can work out if somebody's logged in from multiple places, impossible places all at the same time. By proxying, does it not lose some of the client information that Azure will need?
No.
No, I don't think so.
You're thinking of web proxy.
Yeah.
This is end-to-end proxying of the SAML flow. The client's still talking to each piece directly.
Okay. One other question was, if I'm going to SAML proxy, I might, well, I don't know, I've not looked into it, but if I want some sets of my Shibboleth services to be MFA and some of them not to be MFA, do I have to set up several, I'll have to set up several endpoints in Azure?
I would expect so. Are you
and
talking
set
about the
up
conditional
two flows?
access type?
Yeah.
I think that would be how you would get around doing it. And it's not a use case I've tried, but yes, I would expect that would be one route to doing it.
I guess you'd need less endpoints in Azure and possibly more. If it's passing it back to Azure, you could probably do it with multiple endpoints on the Shibboleth SP side and then multiple flows within the IDP, probably, for that one.
Yeah, but I think in Azure, you'd have, well, at least have 2 endpoints, one which was MFA enabled and one which wasn't.
I think that could very quickly get quite complicated.
Yeah.
Possibly.
yes,
I've not played with the Azure side, so I don't know if it's possible
Okay.
to pass those requirements back via the SAML layer. If you
I-
can, then it's fine.
Yeah, not sure.
Okay.
Any other questions? No question is too stupid.
There was a logout question and I tried to answer it, but in a nutshell, logout without proxying is really, really, really hard and borderline impossible, and will become totally impossible very, very soon because of browser changes. And logout with proxying is effectively not even worth talking about.
Right.
You mentioned in the previous slides, you mentioned using Apache. Can you do the same with Jetty?
Not in a way that we've tested.
Okay.
The native proxying that Scott was alluding to that's built into v4, probably.
Yep.
I don't see why I wouldn't. In fact, it will. But this process of sort of handing it off to an external module, which is how we've done it for v3, needs... no, it won't, because it needs the AJP protocol. As far as I'm aware, it needs the AJP protocol to pass the remote user variable in correctly. Now, there might be a way to remap that.
You can pass other things. The remote user support is abstract. You can look for headers and things. And
okay.
So I wouldn't do it, but it is possible to do.
Thanks.
I think primarily what we were trying to achieve in this is to do this in the lightest touch way that we can without changing too many of the running components.
It's fully supported. It's just once you start practicing like that, you open up all kinds of opportunities for attacks, and people often don't realize how open their proxying infrastructures are to attack until somebody points it out. So.
Cool. I will pass over to John then.